Hi, Tony from All the Remote Things here again, and this time I've got Mike Burrows with me. How are you, Mike?
Hi, Tony. Great to be here.
Fantastic. Of course, it's about 9 o'clock in the morning over there in England. So, and I'm sitting in Australia, so we're doing that traversing the globe again.
Yeah, yeah.
And Mike, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself.
So, yes, I'm the founder of Agenda Shift and the co-founder of the Agenda Shift Academy. That probably doesn't tell you that much until I tell you what precedes that. So career in first of all in software development. I did a mathematics degree, worked in flight simulation, then software tools, and then I moved into the city of London. In other words, banking, finance, worked for investment banks and so on. At the sort of height of that, I was an executive director at UBS, the investment bank, actually running fixed income securities on the technology side. At the time of the credit crunch, to put it mildly, the most intensive time.
Great time.
Yeah, that was quite an experience. When that came to an end, I won't tell you how, but you can probably guess. I then ended up as the CTO of a late stage startup, and that's I didn't know it at the time, but that became the case study for my first book, Kanban from the Inside. And I've since written a couple of more books, so I moved into consulting, training, and now I'm sort of all in on the Agenda Shift Academy. So we're doing like self-paced training and so on in the leadership and strategy space. So yeah, that's who I am.
That's a brilliant intro and a great segue into starting the conversation around Agenda Shift. So if you're watching this and you're thinking, what is Agenda Shift? We'll get there. But what I want to do, I talked to Mike about, I want to start a little bit back and how it evolved to Agenda Shift, because I think that's very interesting. And you mentioned that you wrote Kanban from the Inside. I think that was circa 2014 or something.
It was 2014, yes.
Yeah, that period, yeah. So let's talk about, how did you go from Kanban to Agenda Shift?
Yeah. Well, the story there, the story for Kanban from the Inside actually starts a year early. It was the New Year's holiday of 2013. I wrote a blog post called Introducing Kanban Through Its Values. And I did something that no one had done before. I explained Kanban in terms of a system of 9 values: transparency, balance, collaboration, and so on. And that blog post went absolutely wild. It's still, even now, 9 years later, my most popular blog post most years. It's the blog post that changed my career, really. I was the Kanban guy. I was the Kanban values guy.
Yes.
A year and a half later, I published Kanban from the Inside, where the first 9 chapters were those 9 values. And then there was a part 2 that was about, all the other things you should know, all the models you should be aware of. And then a part 3 about how you introduce this stuff. And kind of all of those things are relevant because introducing it through values kind of gave me permission to integrate things. Rather than just focusing on particular practices or particular principles, I could talk about anything that was sort of relevant to the values, what they mean, how they manifest in organizations and so on. And I also really enjoyed sort of opening the door to other things, to systems thinking, to lean and all these other things. And the part 3, the introducing bit, was sort of relevant, but I kind of have mixed feelings about it as well. I think one of the things to be celebrated about Kanban is it is consistent with itself. It tries to introduce itself in a way that's consistent with those values. But I still found as a trainer that I'd have people in the room who didn't know why they were there. And I'm thinking, now it's my job to sell this stuff. Now, what are the conversations that aren't happening in the business? And you look at Agile more generally, and you see these big rollout projects. You either see let's send everybody on some basic Agile training and see what happens, the sheep dip approach, or you see the rollout approach. Let's take a big framework, and we're now going to enter 2 years of pain, and we will live with the consequences of that. And that to me seems absolutely bonkers. I mean, in the consulting world, in the strategy world, the failure of that kind of model, choose a solution, sell it to people, roll it out, live with the consequences. We know how often that goes wrong. And yet the Agile community was doing it and facing a real complex challenge, but doing it old school. I mean, it's just, in a way that's contrary to, everything we know about Agile. I just couldn't understand it. So I sort of stepped back a bit from Kanban and started to think about, well, how do we address this problem? And started to develop some tools that are about helping organizations have the kind of conversations they want to have if they're interested in any of these kinds of tools. And then I stepped back even further from that, what actually are the kinds of conversations that organizations need to have if they're making any kind of big decision, want to pursue any kind of strategy, whether that's driven by internal considerations or customer considerations, and how can we do that in a way that in which people can participate, in which we start to, the principle I arrived at was agreement on outcomes before solutions. And it's like the big what if that's driven Agenda Shift for all these years now, since 2016 or so. What if we put agreement on outcomes before solutions? So instead of starting with a solution and thinking about all its benefits, using outcomes to sell the solution, what if we organized outcomes into a strategy and then found solutions, much smaller solutions typically, solutions that people close to the problems can find, and do it that way? That is a paradigm change. It's completely turning that process backwards. Outcomes leading to solutions, not solutions sold with outcomes. So that was interesting. Started doing that around 2016, as I said. Published the first edition of Agenda Shift was 2018. There was an earlier version on LeanPub before then. Then I did Right to Left, the Digital Leader's Guide to Lean and Agile. That's looking at the whole Lean Agile landscape, the frameworks, tools and techniques, organizational stuff from the perspective of outcomes. And that led me to some other really more interesting things about how organizations work, how organizations don't work, how they're dysfunctional. Started to look a lot more deeply at the theory of organization, theory of change, looking at things like dialogic organization development, generative organization development. Started to connect with some of the people, key figures in academia involved in those things. And we were very excited to find, real like one-to-one correspondence between some of the things I was doing and some of the things they were doing. Look at some of the things like, from the systems world, things like viable system model, very, to many people, quite intimidating model of how dysfunctions arrive in organizations, what organizations need to have if they're going to be viable for the long term. But I worked really hard to find a way of making it accessible and use it as a way to integrate some of my favorite things, So it's the story of, from 2013 to today, 9 years, is really one of integration, using outcomes to integrate, as I did in Kanban from the inside. Sorry, using values to integrate, as I did in Kanban from the inside. And since 2016 or so, using outcomes as the way, using outcomes as a lens on the Agile frameworks, on the bodies of knowledge that, there's a whole constellation of things around Agile that are very interesting and have a lot to contribute. All that knowledge that relates to how change happens in organizations and how organizations work. I find all that stuff deeply, deeply fascinating. But my job is to distill it down into some actionable things that you can move forward with. And that's kind of a constant thing. Always looking for better ways to explain this stuff.
That's a real journey. So I'm going to ask you a couple of hard questions here because when I was looking at Agenda Shift with a couple of people who will remain nameless, one of them said to me, "Isn't that just Agile rebadged?" And so I pose that question to you now. What's the difference between Agile and Agenda Shift?
So Agenda Shift doesn't describe a delivery process. It describes how the change process works. But the interesting thing is that if you do a good job of setting yourself up for change, then you've also done a good job of guiding agile delivery. The real difference is that agile works best at a particular kind of scale. It's teams, things a bit bigger than teams. But agile hasn't solved the problem of how you connect agile delivery to organizational strategy. Strategy is something that happens to you in almost every agile framework that you look at. And that disappoints me. And the agile world hasn't looked deeply enough into how strategy works. Whether it's product strategy, technology strategy, organization strategy, customer strategy, and so on. Those are such exciting things to explore. And if you can find ways of connecting people into that process, and you can find ways of not just teams being self-governing, but achieve real self-organization where the actual structure and process of the organization is actually up for grabs, where all the time, as your environment changes, as your business priority changes, you're looking, does our organization match up to who we want to be, our priorities as an organization, the complexities of the world out there? Can we find a way of organizing and a way of doing that makes all of that make sense to us? That is very different from an agile delivery process. And in fact, the problem with scaling agile is that we're trying to scale something that scales really badly. Process is if you can make process bigger, that's easy. What you don't have is that sort of self-similarity you get with things like strategy, outcomes, objectives, whatever you want to call them. There are so many things that scale in a lot more interesting way than process does. And I think we would do well to look at those kinds of things.
That sort of leads me into the second question, which was you're giving me great segues today. I like it. So you're talking about outcomes, and so the other question was asking me at the time was, well, isn't agenda shift just sort of taking OKRs or the whole idea of OKRs and then using it in a different way?
There is actually quite a nice link with OKRs. I mean, it isn't just OKRs, but OKRs are an important way of actually organizing strategy. And I like OKRs is a slightly controversial subject because it's so easy for OKR to become management by objectives, which is a disaster.
Oh yes.
But I talk about organizations being adaptable, deliberately adaptive organizations. In a deliberately adaptive organization, in a viable organization, each level of organization expresses its own strategy, and it has to take into account the needs of levels above. It needs to take into account the needs of the bits of organization that comprise it, and so on. It's a process of negotiation. It also allows for each layer, each level, each team of teams to express things in language that makes sense at that level. And different parts of the organization, different levels of the organization work at different levels of abstraction. At the top of the organization, things like financial drivers, for example, are super important. Down at the bottom, the drivers are much more functional, and you measure performance in very different ways. And to see the effect of, say, a practice down at team level, and see the effect on that, the bottom line is measured in the top of the organization, it's impossible. So what you do, the organization develops a strategy that's takes account of the strategies of the levels below, and strategy emerges. It's an emergent process that comes in the negotiation between layers. So what we're doing with agenda shift is when you're focusing on a particular scope of organization, you're thinking about, well, what's our context? What's our strategic context? What drives us having this conversation today? What would ideal look like? What are our obstacles? Let's be realistic about what's in the way of what we'd like to achieve. And then we'll turn to outcomes. There are different tools that we use for moving between rather than moving from to, because it's kind of it's a nice fractal thing. If every outcome is an obstacle in the way, for any obstacle you can find outcomes. And from from any of those, you can think about, well, what does ideal look like? So it's not just a linear thing, but you've got to organize it afterwards. The worst thing to do, you've had an interesting conversation, and it might have taken an hour, it might have taken a day. The worst thing to do is say, okay, so what are our next steps? And you throw away like 95% of the conversation. You agree some next steps and kind of ignore everybody else. And what you have to do is to organize the results of that conversation somehow. And there's some great tools for doing that. So visually, we're talking about mapping. So we're talking about things like, you may have had a Wardley mapping, which is a well-known tool. We use a variant of it called option relationship mapping. It works much better with outcomes than Wardley mapping does. But other tools like that help you visualize where could we start, and given where we want to get to, where should we start? And you are beginning to make some choices and some commitments. You're developing a theory of how things are going to work and so on. So that is strategy. OKR is just a very succinct way of expressing that. If we want to get to here are some of the other things that we'll need to have got, some other key results that we'll need to get to along the way. Andy Grove wrote, first put in high output management, and an objective describes what you want. Key results are how you pace yourself to get there. I think the reason why so many OKRs are rubbish is there's no theory about how we'll get to our objective. All it is, actually, most of your KRs are really just O's. They're just things that we need to achieve. You could express it as a hypothesis. We believe if we do A, B, and C, we'll start to see D, E, and F. These are all, and you could do it with challenge mapping, with how might we's. We've got a big how might we and some smaller how might we's underneath. So the possible ways of expressing strategy is actually quite rich. What we're doing in Agenda Shift and with the Academy in particular is teaching people the language of outcomes, how to have these conversations, how to organize the results. And OKR is an interesting part of that, but to do OKR well, you've got to be serious about what it's trying to do and what the dysfunction is that you can introduce by thinking about it the wrong way.
Yeah, and that's something, in my career in time I see, particularly I've got to poke a little bit at some big consultancies who generally purvey that in a way where, the OKRs become tied to physical, I call it physical, like, a piece of work, and we're going to put our OKRs against that piece of work. Yeah. And that is definitely not the intention of either Mr. Doe or Andy.
Yeah, yes. I've had a lot of fun, with done, help teams improve their OKRs. There are some really good questions to have up your sleeve. Given a solution, if you ask, then what happens? That turns a solution into an outcome. A very, very easy technique, and some of the, and you can ask them what happens again, and you get to a longer term, more aspirational, more ambiguous outcome, and so on. You start to teach people these questions, and there's many of them, and you help people navigate this sort of landscape of obstacles and outcomes, and also explore the ideal as well. If you can't describe something compelling, why are you even bothering?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with you greatly there.
Yeah.
So the other question I really want to ask you is, okay, so you did talk about scaling, and we're not here to
pick that one. Yes.
Delve deep into the scaling frameworks because we could go down that rabbit hole. But essentially, there are scaling frameworks that claim to have this whole strategic thing worked out, and yet we keep seeing the problems that we're seeing.
Well, if you look at the posters, strategy is just something in the corner of the poster.
Yeah, along with customer often. So
yeah, exactly. As I said before, strategy is something that happens to you, and the process is imposed on you. It's that I say we should challenge that. We shouldn't leave that unchallenged. Keep asking the what if. What if we put agreements on outcomes before solutions? And that's a very generative question. It's also quite a provocative question if you ask it at the right time, in the right place, in the right way. So yeah, that's driven me now for for the last 6 years, and I've tell people that I committed the rest of my career to it. Yeah.
So the other thing for me then is when you look at agenda shift, and I've been garnering a few questions around this, right? So where does agenda shift sit in the transformation landscape? And I asked that, I have a fair idea myself, but there's a lot of questions around there because there's a lot of transformational frameworks, right?
Yes. So helpfully, the OD community, the organization development community, have kind of helped answer that question. There was a very important book published this decade, last decade, sorry, called Dialogic Organization Development. That was by Bush and Marshak. So these are people that I've now connected with. I read that book expecting, because there's one little twist here I should tell you. One of our favorite tools is an assessment. And most people, when they hear assessment, they think, this will tell me what's wrong with me. And the consultant will tell me what I should do. That's not what we do with it. What we use it as is a way to start an ideal obstacles outcomes conversation, and we call that the IDO pan, ideal obstacles outcomes. People choose themselves which of the prompts they think are interesting. They imagine for themselves what good looks like. They identify themselves, the obstacles, and the outcomes that they want. But I read the book thinking, well, right from the very beginning, it contrasts a diagnostic approach, identify what's wrong, prescribe a solution, typically that work done by someone external to the organization, with a dialogic approach where everything flows from the conversations the organization has, the conversations the organization really needs to have. And it's based on the idea that you start to get philosophical, but that organizations are social constructions. A healthy organization is one that's having the right conversations, and so on and so on. So from that moment, I realized that agenda shift was actually more, in fact, much more a dialogic approach than a diagnostic approach. So that was interesting. And then Jervis Bush, Professor Jervis Bush, wrote a short book called The Dynamics of Generative Change. And there's a little sort of circular model in it called a generative change model. And for the second edition of Agenda Shift, I reconciled the two models, and the reconciliation, it's one-to-one. I mean, it's extraordinarily strong. So we could say Agenda Shift is an example of a generative change model. So the academic model, the generative change model, it's an abstract model. It describes things that have been seen to work. And Agenda Shift is a particular instance of it with it takes a particular stance, an outcome-oriented stance. That's not part of the abstract model. It doesn't need to be. But we take a particular stance, the one that's driven our development over the years. So we can say with some confidence now, we know exactly where we fit into that landscape, and it's well outside of the typical consulting approach, which on a good day is diagnose and recommend and roll out and live with the consequences. On a bad day is sell the framework, roll it out, and live with the consequences, paying very little attention to organizational context. I don't know how you justify that, to be honest. The means don't justify the ends, and knowing how the sorry record of rollout projects, the means are pretty rubbish as well.
Yeah.
So I stand well apart from most of that industrialized agile transformation business. We are antithetical to it, and I'm not afraid to say so.
Yeah, I have an opinion on answer to your rhetorical question, I guess, but my opinion on this is not a popular opinion sometimes, of course, but cost out plays a big part, and how they justify that, and the framework will work if you do X, and if we remove X and we remove X, and then the organization has to live with that, and I've seen that many times as well.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So Yeah, it's not
I'm not
something.
totally against frameworks. I mean, the frameworks do help you understand how things fit together. They give you a library of useful solutions and so on. It's the linear solution-driven approach to implementation that I object to most strongly. Yeah.
Which is great, seeing as remote agility framework, but it is part of what I do. But yeah, and again, that's the thought pattern that drove us, is thinking about not being that linear process, and the framework should be able to be designed for the context of the organisation, not the
Yes.
other way around, right?
Yes.
The context of
Well,
the
yeah.
organisation
Yes.
designed to fit inside the framework.
Yes. I think that's a start, at least. I think it needs to be an emergent thing.
Yes.
If you haven't found a way to use the experience of the people who are actually experiencing the problems every day, then you are, to put it mildly, missing a trick. Yeah.
Yeah, and very, very fair. Now, I might take a little sideways here, and we'll talk about something else that you're quite well known for. You've written some blog posts
Yep.
around, um, Agile and Scrum, and what you felt wasn't quite right with them, shall we say? Did you want to talk about that a little bit?
We can do. I mean, we'll start with the easy. So the blog post you're probably thinking of, what I really think about X.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what I really think about SAFe, what I really think about Scrum, and what I really think about Kanban. So what I really think about SAFe, that really is the stuff we've been talking about. I'm not totally against frameworks. You could describe Kanban as a framework. I've written a good book on it. Still buy my book. I'm not ashamed of it. By any stretch. But taking that linear approach to rolling them out, that to me is indefensible. And so that that really is the main thrust of that article. Again, it's obviously quite a clickbaity title. That what I think about SAFe is, again, a very popular article. What I think about Scrum is actually, I think, a bit more interesting. As well as what I think about Scrum, there's also a post called something like "Right to Left Works for Scrum Too." And the thing with Scrum is that there are actually, and it's true of SAFe as well to an extent, but there are two Scrums. There's the Scrum that is heads down, plowing through backlogs, a mediocre at best experience delivering mediocre products. That is the backlog-driven left to right version of Scrum. And then there's the right to left version of Scrum, shared objectives pursued goal by goal. And that, I think, is much truer to the original, going back to the very, very beginnings of Scrum as an innovation process, is much closer to what it was all about. So shared objectives pursued goal by goal. Your sprint backlog is just your best representation of your best understanding of what you need to do to achieve your goal, very much as we were just talking about in OKR. And your product backlog is just a list of things that you could do. And some attention to that makes sure that you don't run out of good ideas. So working backwards from the moments of impact. And right to left, is a pattern that's about sort of building on that, making sure that we're always working towards achieving outcomes, needs met. My definition of done, someone's need was met. Making sure we're clear about whose need, what need, how we'd know we've met it before we're talking about the how. So again, outcomes before solutions. But also looking ahead to really done, where we account for all the learning, which the best Scrum teams do. If your retrospective is just about complaining about the state of your workspace, then you're not doing that. So really accounting for all the learning, the work staying on the agenda, staying on that right-hand column of your Kanban board if you're doing Kanban, until you've actually learned all there is to learn about the customer, about the product, your platform, your process, yourselves, that you learned in the process of delivering that work. And you actually will own up to the assumptions that you made at the beginning that proved not to be true. How you're changing your thinking as a result. So that's just double loop learning, if you like. So there's it's how you design and facilitate those key moments, those key feedback moments, your stand-up meetings, those review meetings, things like 3 amigos as well as an opportunity to explore needs and make sure that the work is set up in the right way. So that's right to left. I think Scrum is small enough that I worry less about imposing it. I don't like imposing anything, but Scrum is small enough that you can explain it to a team, and you can present it as an experiment, and they can give it a go. And the same is true of Kanban as well. I think there are better ways of implementing these things. I would look first at what we want to achieve and what's in the way of those, and how can Scrum and Kanban and even the bigger frameworks help with that. But I'm not going to waste time fighting Scrum, fighting Kanban. I think they actually give us some of the language that we need to explain how things work, and I think they should be celebrated for that. And to be fair to SAFe, it has contributed things. It's contributed some of that as well. So you've got to be fair, about these things. What I think about Kanban, again, we've had those conversations already in terms of, well, why are these people in the room being trained when they don't know why they're there? And that was an aha moment for me. I think if I'm going to criticize Kanban, I think agree to pursue evolutionary change. What does that even mean? And I understand evolutionary change is an attempt to describe an alternative to that sort of linear left to right kind of change that I've been so forceful about. But evolution is something that happens anyway. And I don't believe in evolutionism, which says it's inevitable that if you do evolutionary change, you'll get to somewhere good. I believe there has to be some intent, there has to be some strategy as well. I think if you talk to people in the Kanban world that know what they're doing, there's some of that thinking is there. But I think the metaphor gets in the way. I mean, that's not much of a criticism. It's got the wrong metaphor. But then Scrum has some of these, some problems of its own. I've talked about left to right Scrum, right to left Scrum. It doesn't do enough, I think, to counter the wrong kind and encourage the good kind. Unlike with Kanban, I know how I did the values for Kanban. It was an abstraction from how it actually worked. It's much harder to see the relationship between Scrum and its values. They are just things that say, well, if you're going to be successful with Scrum, you probably need to be worrying about those. Maybe that's fine. Maybe that's good enough. It's just intellectually for me, that's not quite satisfying enough.
I think in essence too, I started out doing extreme programming, XP, in 2000, and I think the thing I say to people all the time is I very rarely see anywhere doing pure Scrum, because pure Scrum, as per the guide, it just, as all the things you've just said, right? All the things you just said occur. And some of those things that were in extreme programming, for me, you can't get away without those and mixing those with some of the other frameworks.
I think Scrum tries to be all things to all people.
Yeah.
And actually, I wish it made a stronger stance, and a stance in the direction of goals and goals and objectives and things. It may have changed now, but the first time I read the Scrum at Scale guide, I was very, very disappointed. It seemed even more leaning towards the left to right version than the right to left version. Said very little about goals. I found that very disappointing.
I think they've just taken it and extrapolated.
When you scale that with something like SAFe, if your SAFe implementation is plugged into a PMO, they're still measuring outputs and how far you've got through the plan, rather than measuring meaningful outcomes. And that there's a negotiation around outcomes and there's a negotiation around strategy, then it's going to be same old, unfortunately, with this with slightly different structure and ceremonies and so on.
So one little question, we were talking before we came on air, and we always try to talk a little bit about the remote thing. So you've talked about agenda shift, and you've talked about your business, and so you've also had to convert to the remote thing. And
Yeah.
so now you've been working through how you do this agenda shift thing with remote or with organisations
Yes.
as well. So interested just to tap into that a little bit before we end.
Yeah, for me, it was a case of every cloud has a silver lining, really. I was doing something I knew wasn't quite right. I was globetrotting. Now, in the few weeks leading up to the COVID outbreak, I was in India, in Florida, and in Scandinavia. And things started to get really scary on my trip to Scandinavia. I was in Copenhagen and Malmö, either side of the bridge. And second day of my workshop, half the people weren't there because they were in emergency meetings about COVID. And then completely coincidentally, there was very bad weather and they closed the bridge as well. So I wasn't even sure if I was going to get home. But I came home, and for the sake of my daughter, she's very vulnerable, she has a metabolic disorder, I quarantined myself. So this is my studio. It's a converted double garage. It's actually a really nice space. I stayed here for a week, worked like crazy. I was exhausted at the end of it. But I made a decision, and with my wife, made a decision, we've got to work out how to do this remotely. We can't wait for COVID to blow over. It might not blow over. And now, as it turned out, it's taken 2 years to get to where we are now. And I think we've seen like a civilization scale culture shift.
Yes.
A lot of people don't want to go back to how it was before. I've got 2 sons, both in the technology industry, who love working from home. And I'm also half of a full-time care team. For me, being at home is a blessing. It's hugely valuable to us. It's not just a convenience. It makes a massive difference to my life and to the life of my family. So yeah, I was doing most of Agenda Shift is workshop based, and being present is really important when you're a facilitator, and you can get away with so much if your slides aren't quite right, but you're in the room, you can make up for it. And I found as I moved things online that being present was something I had to pay real attention to. The materials had to be really up to scratch. But also, I've said, Agenda Shift is it's a dialogic approach. It's about conversation. And not all of that conversation is or even should be facilitated from the front of the room, facilitated by the person in control of Zoom. There's a lot happens in breakout groups. Really, the magic happens in breakout groups. So I had to work out. I mean, it wasn't an insurmountable problem by any stretch, but I had to work out how do people go to breakout rooms, knowing what they're doing, got enough guide, feel supported, have places to capture the results of their conversations and so on. And what I actually went for was, for every workshop, every breakout group gets a Google Docs workbook. For some people, the answer is Miro. They got really tired of spending the first 20 minutes of a workshop explaining how Miro worked, and kind of with Google Docs, it was like the easy option. Actually, it is super efficient. So if you're having a conversation, people can capture the results, and other people can be editing the capture of the results. It's actually the capturing of the results is like co-produced. And when we're having one of our favorite exercises, 15-minute photo from obstacles to outcomes in just 15 minutes. This is teams producing lists of 20, 30, 40 outcomes as part of a 15-minute conversation. That is intense.
Yeah.
And it's really important to capture the results. And actually, I will say that Google Docs works better than paper. Now, give me the chance to do it around the room, people around the table, holding, I've got one here somewhere, holding one of the cue cards with I've got it to hand, holding a cue card with the questions on it and so on. That's a more enjoyable experience. But actually, you can make online workshops work really well, make them very efficient, make them enjoyable. People come away having had a meaningful experience. That's what I'm aiming for. That's what I work very hard to do. Not only that, but also transfer the ability to do that to other people, teach other people how to do that. And you take it to another level. You learn so much more when you're not just doing it, but you're also teaching other people to do it as well. So that's been an interesting process. It was several months of experimentation, and I went to every extreme possible. I mean, for example, I felt myself getting bored when I was presenting PowerPoint over Zoom, and I thought, what if I didn't do any? And I
Yeah.
did whole meetups and whole workshops without a single slide, and then people started to complain. So you work out where is the sweet spot? How much of it, the experience, should be supported by slides? How much shouldn't? How do you make them available to people? And so on and so on and so on. And the only way to get those things right is to test. Yeah. And I'm fortunate to have other people who will test as well. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Look, we're very close to the end of our time. So, look, I thank you for spending the time with us today and really giving us the insights and outs.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. If anyone's listening to this, we hope, and you like it, please subscribe. Also, don't forget about the Remote AF community, remoteaf.co, and click the community button and join us. We've got a big group of people talking about remote and many things like this. Mike, again, thank you for being on all the remote things. It's been a wonderful experience.
Thank you. Absolutely my pleasure.